He was made of stillness and shadow, a man who commanded a room by simply breathing its air. But in that moment, all his power meant nothing. His hand was on the door of the gleaming black SUV, the polished handle cool beneath his fingertips, when a much smaller, softer hand landed on his chest. It was the waitress. The chubby one with the nervous eyes and a faint dusting of flour on her cheek that she'd somehow missed. Her touch was hesitant, yet it stopped him cold. She fumbled with the knot of his silk tie, her fingers trembling as she made a clumsy show of adjusting it. And then she leaned in, her breath a warm, terrified whisper against his jaw. "Don't get in the car." The world narrowed to the feel of her soft palm against his starched shirt and those 5 quiet words. 5 words that felt less like a warning and more like the turning of a key in a lock he never knew existed. Clara had spent the entire evening feeling invisible. It was her default state. At 18, she had learned that a girl of her size moved through the world as either an obstruction or as background scenery. In a place like Vespertine, with its hushed carpets and clinking crystal, she was firmly the latter. She refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and murmured, "Excuse me," 100 times, her body an apology for the space it occupied. The men at table 7, Marco's table, were no different. They spoke in low, gravelly Italian, their bespoke suits stretching across powerful shoulders. They looked through her, their eyes gliding over her plain white shirt and long red apron as if she were a piece of furniture. The man at the head of the table, Marco, was the center of their universe. He had a face that belonged on an old Roman coin, all harsh angles and heavy-lidded authority. He hadn't looked at her once, not really, but she had looked at him. She had noticed the way his stillness was more commanding than any shout, the way his dark eyes missed nothing, even when they seemed half-closed. There was a coiled danger in him that both terrified and fascinated her. She had been clearing a nearby table when 2 of his bodyguards had stepped into the service corridor for a smoke, their hulking forms blocking the light. She'd flattened herself into a recess to stay out of their way, her invisibility her shield. They thought they were alone. "The package is set," one of them, a man with a thick neck and a cruel mouth, had muttered. Timer's on for 90 seconds after the remote unlock. He gets in, door closes, boom, the other had grunted in agreement. He'll never see it coming. Serves him right for trusting family. Clara's heart had seized in her chest. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold and dizzy. They were talking about him. About Marco. They were going to kill him. Her entire body screamed at her to do nothing. To fade back into the dining room, finish her shift, and forget what she'd heard. These were not men who tolerated witnesses. They were killers. Getting involved was a death sentence. She could feel the frantic pulse beating in her throat, a wild bird trapped in a cage of flesh. She watched them through the crack in the service door as they rejoined the table, their faces placid, their loyalty a perfect, deadly mask. She looked at Marco. He was listening to another man speak, his expression unreadable, but his hand rested on the table, his long fingers curled slightly. A king on his throne, completely unaware of the serpents coiled at his feet. She thought about her small apartment, her cat, the overdue bill on her counter. A life that was quiet and anonymous and, above all, safe. She could keep it that way. All she had to do was turn around and walk away. But her feet remained rooted to the floor. An image flashed in her mind, the gleaming black SUV she'd seen parked out front, the one with the driver waiting patiently. A package. A timer. He gets in, boom. She couldn't. A stubborn, fiery piece of her she didn't even know existed refused to let a man walk to his death, no matter who he was. Her fear was a physical thing, a cold sickness in her stomach, but the thought of the alternative, of hearing the explosion and knowing she did nothing, was worse. Her decision was not brave. It felt like a compulsion, an inevitability. She untied her apron, her hands shaking so badly she fumbled with the knot. She hung it on its hook, smoothed down her simple white shirt, and walked out of the service corridor. The whole world seemed to be moving in slow motion as she crossed the plush carpet, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to get to him before he left. He and his men were rising from the table. The meal was over. Laughter, deep and masculine, echoed slightly in the quiet restaurant as they moved toward the entrance, a phalanx of expensive suits and latent violence. The two traders were among them, positioned near the back, watching. Clara moved, with a purpose that felt alien to her. She intercepted them near the maitre d' station, her path putting her directly in front of Marco. His eyes, dark and dismissive, finally landed on her. For a second, she was just a clumsy waitress in his way. Annoyance flickered across his features. "Excuse me," one of the bodyguards grunted, moving to shoulder her aside. But Clara's gaze was locked on Marco. She reached out, her hand trembling but determined, and laid it flat on the solid wall of his chest. The fabric of his suit was impossibly fine, the heat of his body radiating through it. He went utterly still, his surprise so profound it was like a crack in a marble statue. Everyone stopped. The air crackled with sudden, sharp tension. "Your tie," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "It's crooked." Her fingers found the slick, cool silk of his tie. It was perfect, of course. She made a show of adjusting the knot, her thumb brushing against the column of his throat. She felt the powerful, steady beat of his pulse there. She leaned closer, her world shrinking to the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something clean, like winter air, and the intimidating proximity of his face. Her whisper was so faint she was terrified he wouldn't hear it over the frantic drumming of her own heart. "Don't get in the car." She met his eyes. They were no longer dismissive. They were sharp, focused, boring into her with an intensity that stole her breath. He saw her. For the first time all night he was truly seeing her. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze, a rapid calculation. He didn't question her. He didn't laugh. He simply absorbed her words, and in an instant, his entire posture shifted from relaxed authority to lethal readiness. His hand came up, not to push her away, but to cover hers where it still rested on his chest, his fingers wrapping around her own, holding her in place. His grip on her hand was like steel. He didn't let go. With his other hand, he made a small, almost imperceptible gesture to a man standing just behind his left shoulder, a loyal lieutenant named Rico, who had been with him for 20 years. Rico's eyes narrowed, his hand drifting casually toward the inside of his jacket. The two traders, seeing their boss delayed by a clumsy waitress, exchanged a look of fleeting impatience. Marco's focus, however, was entirely on Clara. "Walk with me," he said. His voice was a low rumble, not a request but an unbreakable command. He began moving toward the restaurant's side exit, the one that led to the alley, pulling her along with him. His body was a shield between her and the rest of his men. "What's going on, boss?" one of the traders called out, taking a step forward. "Change of plans," Marco said over his shoulder, his tone mild, yet it stopped the man in his tracks. They were almost to the alley door when the world outside the restaurant's grand windows lit up with a flash of brilliant, violent orange. A split second later, the sound hit them, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. The plate glass windows of the dining room bowed inward and then exploded, spraying razor-sharp shards across the elegant tables. Screams erupted. The air filled with the smell of gasoline and fire. Marco reacted with the speed of a predator. He shoved Clara behind him, his body a solid barrier, and simultaneously drew a sleek, dark pistol from a holster at the small of his back. The motion was so fluid, so practiced, it was like an extension of his own arm. He pushed the alley door open, hauling her out into the cold night air as Rico materialized beside them, weapon already drawn, and scanning the darkness. The black SUV, or what was left of it, was a mangled, burning pyre in the street, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. The heat washed over them even from a distance, a furious, living thing. Chaos reigned in the street. Car alarms blared a dissonant chorus, while people shouted and ran. But in the small bubble of space around Marco, there was only a chilling, deadly calm. His eyes, reflecting the flickering orange of the flames, were fixed on the wreckage. His face was a mask of cold fury, a terrible and controlled rage that was far more frightening than any shout. He still had a hold of Clara's hand, his grip crushing, anchoring her to him in the swirling madness. He pulled her with him, down the alley, away from the screaming and the fire. She stumbled, her mind struggling to catch up with the violent reality that had just ripped her quiet life apart. "Rico." Marco's voice cut through the noise, sharp as broken glass. "The sedan." Now Rico was already moving, his own gun a dark silhouette as he scanned rooftops and doorways, clearing a path for them through the shadows. Clara felt like a doll being dragged along, her feet barely keeping up. They reached a dark, nondescript sedan parked at the far end of the alley, its engine already rumbling quietly. Rico wrenched the back door open, and Marco bundled her inside, without ceremony. He slid in after her, his large frame filling the space, his presence overwhelming in the enclosed dark. The door slammed shut, cutting off the symphony of sirens and alarms, plunging them into a sudden, shocking silence. The car smelled of rich leather and Marco's cold, dangerous fury. He finally released her hand. She flexed her numb fingers, staring at the red marks his grip had left on her skin. She looked at him. In the dim light from the street, his face was all hard planes and shadows. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped his knee. He hadn't saved her. He had taken her. The distinction felt terrifyingly important. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, melting into the city traffic, leaving the fire and her old life burning behind them. The drive was silent and tense. Clara sat pressed against the door, trying to make herself small, acutely aware of the man beside her. He was a vortex of controlled violence, and she had willingly thrown herself into the heart of it. They drove for what felt like an eternity before pulling into the subterranean garage of a sleek, anonymous glass tower. Rico led them to a private elevator, and they ascended in silence, the only sound the quiet hum of the machinery. The apartment they entered was just as sterile as the building's exterior. It was a place of cool marble, dark wood, and vast windows showcasing a glittering, indifferent city. It wasn't a home, it was a holding cell, albeit a luxurious one. Marco finally let go of her arm as the door clicked shut behind them. He gestured to a low leather sofa. "Sit." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. She obeyed, sinking into the cool leather, her body trembling with delayed shock. He didn't sit. He paced before the windows, a caged panther silhouetted against the skyline. He spoke to Rico in rapid, clipped Italian. Names were mentioned, the two bodyguards, Luca and Johnny. A quiet, lethal order was given. Rico simply nodded and left, the door closing with a heavy, final sound. Now they were alone. Marco stopped pacing and turned to face her. For a long moment, he just watched her, his dark eyes cataloging every detail, her flushed face, her trembling hands, the cheap fabric of her work shirt. He was seeing her, all of her, and it felt more invasive than any physical touch. "Tell me," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle, which was somehow more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Tell me everything you heard." Every single word. She recounted the conversation from the service corridor, her voice shaky at first, then steadying as she focused on the details. The package, the timer, the casual cruelty in their voices. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he nodded slowly, a dark satisfaction settling in his eyes. He believed her. He had believed her from the very first moment. He moved from the window and sat in the armchair opposite her, the space between them charged with unspoken things. He leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, his gaze never leaving her face. The predator was at rest, but no less dangerous. For the first time, he let himself truly look at her. Not at the waitress, not at the warning, but at the woman. She was young, barely out of girlhood. Soft. Her body was full and curved, a stark contrast to the sharp, angular women who usually moved through his world. Her eyes were wide and brown, and right now they were filled with a terror she was trying very hard to conceal. A flicker of something that felt dangerously like admiration stirred within him. She had seen his own men bred for violence and intimidation, plotting his death, and she had walked directly toward him. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't run to the police. She had come to him. An act of suicidal, breathtaking courage. Or perhaps, he thought, an act of instinct. The prey running to the more dominant predator for protection. He felt a wave of possessiveness, so fierce it was a physical blow. She had saved him. Her quiet perception, her impossible nerve, had untangled a knot of betrayal he had failed to see. That act tied her to him. It made her his responsibility. It made her his. The thought settled in his chest, not as an idea, but as an irrefutable fact. He was furious with Luca and Johnny, not just for their treason, but for their carelessness. For speaking where she could hear. For forcing her into this. For putting her in the path of the fire and glass that had been meant for him. They had threatened something that now belonged to him, and for that, their punishment would be biblical. "You cannot go home," he said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones. "They saw you with me. They saw me pull you away. If they have anyone else working with them, your apartment will be the first place they look." He was not lying, but it was not the entire truth. The truth was, he had no intention of ever letting her go. Clara stared at him, the meaning of his words slowly sinking through the fog of shock. Not going home. The phrase echoed in the silent, empty apartment. Her cat, Mrs. Higgins. The wilting plant on her windowsill. Her worn-out copy of her favorite book on the nightstand. The small, insignificant pieces of her life felt a million miles away. "For how long?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marco's expression didn't change, but a subtle darkness deepened in his eyes. "For as long as it takes to ensure you are safe." It was a promise of protection that sounded perilously like a life sentence. She was a witness. A loose end. But when she looked at him, she didn't see a man planning to eliminate a threat. She saw something else, something more complicated and consuming. He was watching her as if she were a rare and precious object he had just acquired. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else was beginning to bloom alongside it, a strange, dizzying sense of importance. For her entire life, she had been overlooked. Now, she was the absolute focus of the most powerful and dangerous man she had ever met. Rico returned an hour later. He didn't speak to her, only to Marco, their Italian conversation too low and fast for her to follow. But she saw the grim finality in Rico's nod before he left again. The problem of Luca and Johnny had been solved. Permanently. After Rico was gone, Marco rose and disappeared into another room, returning with a folded pile of clothes. He set them on the couch beside her. A soft cashmere sweater and a pair of silk lounge pants. They were impossibly luxurious, a world away from her worn jeans and cheap work shirts. "These should fit," he said. "There is a bathroom through that door. Get some rest." It was another command disguised as a suggestion. She took the clothes and stood on shaky legs, her body aching with adrenaline and exhaustion. As she walked toward the bathroom, she felt his eyes on her back, a tangible weight, a brand of ownership she knew, with terrifying certainty, she would never be free of. The next few days passed in a surreal haze. The luxurious apartment became her gilded cage. Marco was a constant, silent presence. He worked from a laptop at the large dining table, his phone buzzing with quiet demands, his empire run with a few curt words. He provided her with food, with books, with anything she might need, but he never provided her with an exit. He would watch her as she read, or as she stared out the window at the sprawling city below. The intensity of his gaze was unnerving, yet she found herself beginning to crave it. It was a form of attention she had never known, absolute and undivided. One afternoon, he finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "Why did you do it?" he asked, closing his laptop. "Why warn me? You had to know who I was. You had to know the risk." Clara looked up from her book. She had asked herself the same question 1,000 times. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I just couldn't not." She looked at him, at his severe, handsome face. It wasn't about who you are. It was about what they were going to do. It was wrong. A flicker of something warm moved in his eyes. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was something deeper, more proprietary. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city. In my world, right and wrong are luxuries. There is only loyalty and betrayal. Power and weakness, he turned back to her. You showed me loyalty when my own blood showed me betrayal. He took a step closer. That has value. That has meaning. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, a jolt that went straight through her. I reward loyalty, Clara, he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to resonate in her bones. I protect what is mine, there it was again. Meaning. The word hung in the air between them, a declaration and a promise. She should have been terrified. A part of her was. But another, larger part of her felt a profound, earth-shattering sense of peace. She had a place. She belonged somewhere. She belonged to him. One evening, Marco had to leave. A situation demanded his personal attention, something that couldn't be handled over the phone. He stood at the door, dressed in a dark suit that made him look like a king of the underworld. Rico will be outside the door, he told her, his eyes locking with hers. You will not open it for anyone but me. Do you understand? She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. The thought of him leaving, even for a few hours, filled her with a surprising anxiety. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. He took a step back toward her and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. I will not be long, he promised. And then he leaned down and pressed a firm, chaste kiss to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of sealing a pact. A brand of ownership. After he left, the silence of the apartment felt heavy and oppressive. Clara tried to read, but the words swam before her eyes. An hour passed. Then, two. She was standing by the window when she saw it. A dark sedan, identical to the one Rico had driven them in, was parked across the street. It had been there when she first looked, and it was still there now. That wasn't necessarily suspicious. But then, a man got out to clean the windshield, a pointless gesture on a clear night. As he moved, his jacket shifted, and she saw the glint of metal tucked into his waistband. A flicker of movement in a darkened window of the building opposite caught her eye. It was nothing, just a reflection, probably. But her mind, sharpened by days of tension, was screaming that something was wrong. She thought about Marco's words. If they have anyone else working with them. They hadn't gotten everyone. She went to the door, her heart pounding. She couldn't call Rico on the intercom. They might be listening. She had to warn him. But how? Her eyes scanned the room and landed on the heavy marble chessboard on a side table. An idea, desperate and crazy, took root. She picked up the solid black king, its weight of comfort in her hand. She took a deep breath, went to the vast window, and with all her might, she threw it. The heavy piece sailed through the air and shattered against the sedan's windshield across the street with a sharp crack, creating a spiderweb of broken glass. The man outside jumped, startled, his hand immediately going to his weapon. Down below, she saw Rico, alerted by the sound, melt out of the building's entrance, his own gun already in his hand, moving toward the threat with silent, deadly efficiency. She had done it again. She had seen the danger no one else had. When Marco returned, the street below was clear, the threat neutralized with a quiet, brutal efficiency that left no trace. Rico had met him in the garage, his report brief and filled with a new, profound respect for the girl upstairs. Marco entered the apartment and found Clara curled on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, pretending to be asleep. He knew she wasn't. He walked over and stood looking down at her. This soft, quiet woman who saw the world with such sharp, clear eyes. This girl who possessed a core of steel he was only just beginning to comprehend. She had saved him once through instinct. She had saved his most trusted man, and likely herself, tonight through pure, brilliant observation. He had brought her here to protect her, but he was beginning to realize she was far from helpless. She was a queen, hidden in the guise of a pawn. He reached down and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Her eyes fluttered open. Fear was there, but it was overshadowed by a weary trust. "They're gone," he said softly. "All of them. The thread is over. You are safe." She sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were soft, but they were not weak. He looked into her eyes, letting her see the raw, consuming truth of his obsession. "Now," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "You have a choice. I can give you a new name, a new life, anywhere in the world you want to go. I will ensure you are safe and wealthy beyond your dreams. You would be free." He paused, his grip on her hands tightening. "Or you can stay. Here. With me." He did not say what that meant. He didn't have to. It meant this gilded cage would become her home. It meant his world of shadow and danger would become her own. It meant she would never be invisible again. It meant she would be his. Clara looked at the man kneeling before her. The most dangerous man she had ever known, offering her the one thing she had never had, a place to belong. She thought of her old life, the quiet, lonely invisibility. It wasn't a life, it was an existence. This here, with him, was terrifying and uncertain, but it was real. For the first time, she felt seen, valued, and fiercely protected. She didn't hesitate. "I'll stay," she whispered. A slow, possessive smile spread across Marco's face. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Good," he murmured against her skin. "Because I was never going to let you go." Thank you for joining us for this story. If you enjoyed Clara's journey from overlooked waitress to the queen of an underworld king, please show your support. Like this video, leave a comment telling us your favorite part, and subscribe to the channel for more tales of dark romance and empowerment. Every bit of engagement helps us bring more stories like this to you. We can't wait to see you in the next one.